Imagine being the only guy in a sea of girls. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, for one teenage boy, it's his reality. But what's it really like to be the only male student in an all-girls boarding school? Is it a teenage fantasy come true, or a daily struggle to fit in? In this video, we'll dive into the extraordinary life of the boy who found himself in this unique situation and uncover the surprising truths about his experiences and how he got there in the first place. The warm breeze of late afternoon blew gently through the dusty streets of Wuzari, a quiet town where life moved slowly. Richard sat at the small wooden table in the kitchen, watching his mother, Mama Nandi, as she moved around, preparing their simple dinner. Their home was modest, a two-room house with cracked walls and an old tin roof that rattled whenever the wind picked up. But it was home, and Mama Nandi worked hard to keep it going. Richard had just turned 17, and though he had grown used to their life of struggle, he always admired his mother's strength. Mama Nandi had worked as a maid for as long as he could remember, mostly for one of the wealthiest women in the country, Madame Wikali, who owned the prestigious Ivory Heights Academy. The academy was famous throughout the country as a school for rich girls, daughters of politicians, business moguls, and the elite. Life wasn't easy for Mama Nandi, though. Raising Richard alone since his father disappeared before he was born had taken everything she had. Still, she never complained, and she made sure Richard had clothes on his back and food on his plate, even if they didn't have much else. That evening, as the stew simmered on the stove, Mama Nandi turned to Richard with a serious look on her face. He had seen that look before, and it always meant something important was coming. "Richard, we need to talk," she said, her voice steady but filled with something he couldn't quite read. Richard sat up straight, giving her his full attention. He could tell this wasn't just an everyday conversation. "Madame Wikali came to me with an offer," she began, sitting down across from him. "She wants you to attend Ivory Heights Academy." Richard's eyes widened in shock. "Ivory Heights? But Mama, that's a school for girls. Why would I go there?" Mama Nandi sighed, clearly anticipating his confusion. "I know, Richard, but Madame Wikali thinks it will be good for the girls to learn how to interact with someone like you. These girls, they're sheltered, living in a world of privilege. Madame Wikali believes you can help prepare them for life beyond the school." Richard stared at her, still not understanding. "But why me? I'm just the son of a maid. What could I possibly teach them?" "She trusts you, Richard," Mama Nandi said softly. "Madame Wikali has watched you grow up. She believes you're the kind of young man who can handle this responsibility. You're hardworking, respectful, and most importantly, she believes you won't cause trouble." Richard frowned. "What kind of trouble?" Mama Nandi's face softened, and she hesitated before speaking. "She trusts you to be around the girls without doing anything inappropriate. Madame Wikali knows the risks of having a boy at the school, but she believes you won't let her down. She said she had a discussion with the other parents already, and they are all in if she can provide a trusted person for the task." The idea was still hard to grasp. Richard had grown up seeing the academy from the outside, hearing stories of the rich girls who studied there. But he never thought he'd set foot inside the gates, let alone be a student there. It didn't seem real. "She also promised," Mama Nandi added quietly, "to help pay for your education. If you agree, she'll make sure you can go to university after you finish school." Richard's heart skipped a beat at the mention of university. He had always dreamed of furthering his education, but the cost had always been out of reach. This offer could change everything. It was a strange opportunity, but maybe it was the only one he had. "But what if the girls don't like me, Mama?" he asked, doubt creeping into his voice. "What if they don't want me there?" Mama Nandi reached across the table and took his hand, her voice gentle but firm. "You're strong, Richard. You've faced worse things than a room full of rich girls. You'll be fine. Just be yourself, and they'll see the good in you." Richard was quiet for a moment, letting everything sink in. His mother's words made sense, but the thought of being the only boy in a school full of girls, rich girls no less, was still intimidating. He didn't want to embarrass himself or make things harder for his mother, but the chance to go to university, that was something he couldn't ignore. "I'll do it," Richard said finally, his voice steady. "I'll go." Mama Nandi smiled. though there was a hint of worry in her eyes. "I'm proud of you, Richard. I know it won't be easy, but this is a big opportunity. Just remember who you are and where you come from." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of the decision he had just made. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure: his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The following week, Richard found himself standing in front of the grand gates of Ivory Heights Academy. The tall walls and impressive gardens stretched out before him. His heart raced as he clutched the straps of his worn-out backpack, wondering what kind of world he was about to step into. As he walked through the gates, Madame Wikali was waiting for him near the entrance of the school. She smiled warmly, though there was a seriousness in her eyes. "Welcome to Ivory Heights, Richard. This will be your new home for a while." Richard nodded, unable to find his voice. Everything about the academy was overwhelming. The grand buildings, the well-dressed students who stared at him curiously as they passed by. Madame Wikali led him inside, pointing out the different areas of the school as they walked. "You'll be staying in a special dorm room we've prepared for you," she explained. "You'll attend all the classes with the girls and follow the same rules. The only difference is that you'll have your own space." Richard looked around nervously as they walked past groups of girls. He could feel their eyes on him, some whispering, some staring openly. He had expected this, but it didn't make him feel any less awkward. Madame Wikali continued talking as they reached the dormitory. Inside, Richard found a small but comfortable room waiting for him. It was a huge improvement from the cramped space he shared with his mother back home. "This will be your home while you're here," Madame Wikali said. "I expect you to keep it clean and follow the school rules." Richard nodded again, still taking it all in. The reality of being the only boy at Ivory Heights was beginning to sink in. He wasn't sure how the girls would react to him or how he would navigate this new environment. As Madame Wikali left him to settle in, Richard sat down on the bed, his thoughts swirling. Tomorrow would be his first day in class. The only boy among dozens of girls. How was he going to survive this? The next morning, Richard woke up early, his nerves on edge. He got dressed quickly, looking down at his simple clothes and wondering if they were too plain compared to what the other students would be wearing. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to calm himself. He had faced tough situations before, but this felt different. He wasn't just the new kid at school, he was the only boy. He made his way to the main building, walking through the pristine paths of Ivory Heights Academy. The gardens were perfectly maintained, and the buildings seemed to shine in the morning sunlight. Everywhere he looked, girls in neat uniforms walked in groups, laughing and chatting. As soon as they saw him, the talking stopped. They stared, some whispering, some giggling, while others just looked confused. Richard's face flushed, and he kept his eyes forward, trying to ignore the attention. He didn't want to seem rude, but he didn't know what else to do. He was sure they had never seen someone like him before. Someone from a simple background, someone who didn't belong in their world. When he reached the classroom, the room fell completely silent. All the girls turned to look at him as he stepped inside, unsure where to sit. He stood awkwardly by the door, clutching his notebook. One of the girls, a tall, confident girl with long braids and a polished appearance, was the first to speak. "Isn't that the maid's son?" she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The comment made Richard's heart sink. He had expected this, but hearing it still stung. He knew people would see him that way, but it didn't make it any easier to deal with. Before he could respond, another girl stepped in. "Leave him alone, Zawadi," said Nia, Madame Wikali's daughter, who sat in the front row. Nia's voice was calm but firm, and she turned to Richard with a welcoming smile. "You can sit next to me." Relieved, Richard nodded and quickly took the seat beside her, feeling the stares from all around. As the teacher walked in, the chatter died down, and Richard tried to focus on the lesson, but it was hard to ignore the whispers that continued throughout the room. After the first lesson, Richard was still trying to process everything when the bell rang for a break. As he gathered his things, a group of girls came up to him, their curiosity clearly getting the better of them. Leading the group was Amara, a girl with bright, excited eyes and a wide smile. "So, what's it like being the only boy here?" Amara asked, her voice full of curiosity. "I've never met a boy who wasn't from one of the rich families. What's it like, being from outside?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure how to answer, especially with the way she was looking at him, like he was some kind of rare animal. "It's different," he said quietly. I'm not used to this either." Amara smiled and leaned in closer. "You're like a mystery," We don't get many boys around here, let alone someone who's grown up in a completely different world. Richard gave a small, polite smile, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the way Amara was looking at him made him feel even more out of place. Before the conversation could go any further, Zawadi walked over, her arms crossed and an unimpressed look on her face. "You girls need to stop acting like he's some kind of celebrity," she said, her tone cold. "He's just here because of Madame Wakali. Don't get too carried away." Amara rolled her eyes but didn't say anything. Richard glanced at Zawadi, sensing her hostility. She clearly didn't like him being there, and she didn't seem to care if he knew it. He wasn't sure what her problem was, but he wasn't going to let her intimidate him. The days at Ivory Heights Academy began to pass, but Richard still felt like an outsider. Every day was a new challenge. Some of the girls were starting to warm up to him, while others, like Zawadi, seemed determined to remind him that he didn't belong. He had managed to keep his head down and focus on his classes, but the whispers and stares never really stopped. One afternoon during lunch, Richard found a quiet spot in the school garden. He had hoped to eat his food alone, away from the constant attention, but as he sat down, he heard footsteps behind him. "Mind if I join you?" a familiar voice said. Richard turned to see Amara smiling as she held her tray of food. Without waiting for an answer, she sat down next to him. Richard forced a smile, though he had been hoping for some peace and quiet. "You're really hard to catch alone," Amara said with a grin, taking a bite of her sandwich. "It's like all the girls want to be around you." Richard shrugged, looking down at his food. "I don't know why. I'm just a student like everyone else." Amara laughed. "Maybe because you're the only boy in a school full of girls? That makes you a little special, don't you think?" Richard felt himself blush slightly. "I don't feel special. I just feel out of place." Amara looked at him, her expression softening. "I get that, but you're handling it well. Better than I thought, honestly. The other girls, some of them might not show it, but they're curious about you. They want to know what life's like for someone who isn't from their world." Richard nodded, understanding what she meant. Most of the girls at Ivory Heights had grown up in luxury. They had maids, private drivers, and all the things Richard could only dream of. To them, he was like a window into a world they had never seen before. Just as they were starting to settle into a comfortable conversation, a shadow fell over them. "Enjoying yourself, Amara?" Zawadi's voice cut through the air like a knife. Richard looked up to see Zawadi standing in front of them, arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. She didn't look pleased. "What's your problem, Zawadi?" Amara asked, clearly annoyed. "Can't I sit and talk with Richard without you breathing down my neck?" Zawadi ignored Amara and focused on Richard. "You think you're special, don't you? Just because you're the only boy here, you think you're better than us?" Richard felt the tension rise. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," he replied calmly. "I'm just trying to fit in like everyone else." Zawadi's eyes flashed with irritation. "Don't lie. I see how the girls look at you. You're enjoying the attention." Richard didn't know how to respond. It wasn't like he had asked for any of this, but Zawadi seemed determined to paint him as the bad guy. Before he could defend himself, Amara stood up, glaring at Zawadi. "Leave him alone, Zawadi. You're just jealous." "Jealous?" Zawadi scoffed. "Of him? Please." Amara took a step closer to her, her eyes fierce. "Yeah, jealous. You're scared because he's different, and you don't like that he's getting attention. You think it's going to take away from your little world of being the best at everything." Zawadi's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Richard thought they were about to get into a fight. But instead, Zawadi just turned and walked away, muttering under her breath. Amara sat back down with a huff. "Don't let her get to you," she said, giving Richard a reassuring smile. "Zawadi thinks she runs this place, but she's just scared of anything that shakes things up." Richard nodded, but the encounter left him feeling uneasy. Zawadi wasn't just annoyed. She genuinely seemed to dislike him. He didn't understand why, but it was clear that she wasn't going to make things easy for him. Later that day, during sports practice, Richard was sitting on the sidelines watching the girls play volleyball. He didn't know the rules, and he didn't feel like getting involved, so he stayed back. But to his surprise, Zawadi walked over, tossing a volleyball in her hand. "You know how to play?" she asked, her tone challenging. Richard shook his head. "Not really." Zawadi smirked. "Figures. You don't look like the athletic type." She threw the ball at him, and Richard barely caught it. He stood up, unsure of what she was trying to do. "Come on," she said, her eyes gleaming with challenge. Let's see if you can handle yourself on the court." Richard hesitated. He didn't want to embarrass himself, especially not in front of Zawadi, who was clearly trying to get under his skin. But part of him didn't want to back down either. He wasn't going to let her push him around. Taking a deep breath, he followed her onto the court. The other girls watched with interest, some whispering to each other as Zawadi set up the game. She served the ball and it came flying at him with surprising speed. Richard managed to hit it back, but it wasn't a clean shot. The game continued, with Zawadi going harder and harder, clearly trying to show off. But Richard wasn't giving up easily. He might not have been as skilled as her, but he was determined not to look weak. By the end of the game, both of them were out of breath. Richard was sweating and exhausted, but he had managed to keep up with her, even if just barely. Zawadi, breathing heavily, looked at him with something new in her eyes. It wasn't exactly respect, but it wasn't pure hostility anymore either. "Not bad," she said grudgingly. "Maybe you're not as useless as I thought." Before Richard could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing on the court, unsure if he had won her over or just earned a new challenge. The weeks passed, and Richard was starting to settle into life at Ivory Heights Academy. The initial awkwardness of being the only boy in a school full of girls had faded somewhat, but new challenges were emerging. The girls who had initially been curious about him were now starting to act differently. What had once been simple interest had turned into something more complicated, something Richard wasn't entirely sure how to handle. One of the biggest changes came with Amara, one of the more popular girls in school. She had taken a particular interest in Richard, and lately she had been spending more time with him. Amara was known for her confidence, and she always seemed to be at the center of attention. Her growing closeness to Richard didn't go unnoticed by the other girls. One afternoon, during a school assembly, it was announced that the Academy's annual dance was coming up. The dance was a major event at Ivory Heights, and for the first time, Richard would be part of it. The idea of attending a formal dance made him nervous. He had never been to one before, and he certainly didn't know how to dance. As the day of the dance approached, Amara approached Richard during lunch with her usual confident smile. "Richard, do you know how to dance?" she asked, her tone casual but teasing. Richard, caught off guard, shook his head. "Not really. I've never had to." Amara laughed softly. "I thought so. Don't worry, I can teach you." Richard felt his face heat up. "You don't have to. I'll probably just sit out the dance anyway." "Don't be silly," Amara said with a playful smile. "You'll be fine. Come on, I'll show you." Later that day, Amara led Richard to an empty classroom, where she had prepared a small speaker to play music. She put on a soft, elegant tune and took his hands, guiding him through the basic dance steps. "Relax," she said gently, as she showed him the movements. "It's not as hard as you think. Just follow my lead." Richard tried to focus, but being this close to Amara was making his heart race. She was confident, graceful, and the way she smiled at him made him feel even more self-conscious. He stumbled a few times, but Amara laughed it off, encouraging him to keep going. By the end of the practice session, Richard was starting to get the hang of it. He wasn't perfect, but at least he felt less nervous about the dance. Amara gave him a warm smile as the music ended. "You're doing great, Richard. By the time the dance comes around, you'll be a pro," she said, her voice softer now. "And remember, everyone will be watching. No pressure." Richard smiled back, still feeling a bit nervous but grateful for her help. "Thanks for teaching me. I feel a little more prepared now." Amara winked before leaving the room. "Just don't forget to save me a dance." The night of the dance arrived, and the grand hall of Ivory Heights Academy was transformed with twinkling lights, elegant decorations, and soft music. Richard, dressed in a simple but neat outfit, felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. Being the only boy at the dance made him the center of attention, something he still wasn't used to. When it was time to dance, Amara approached him with a confident smile. She took his hand and led him to the center of the room, where the music began to play. Richard focused on the steps she had taught him, trying to keep up with her graceful movements. To his surprise, everything went smoothly. The other girls watched in admiration as Richard and Amara danced together, their movements in perfect sync. By the end of the song, there was even applause from the crowd. Richard felt a sense of accomplishment, but he also noticed the way some of the girls were looking at him, especially Emily, who had been watching him closely throughout the night. As the dance continued, Emily found an opportunity to approach Richard. Emily was always full of energy, and lately she had been spending more and more time with him. That evening she was particularly excited, bouncing with enthusiasm as she sat down next to him during a break. "Richard, have you ever read manga?" Emily asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Richard smiled and shook his head. "No, I haven't. I've heard of it, but I've never read any." Emily grinned and pulled a colorful manga book out of her bag. "Well, you have to try it. It's so much fun. The stories are amazing." Richard accepted the book, flipping through the pages as Emily eagerly explained the plot and the characters. It was clear she was really passionate about it, and her excitement was contagious. But Emily's love for manga quickly turned into something else. She began acting as though the events of the manga were real, casting herself as the main character and dragging Richard along for the ride. She even pretended to cast spells from the book, convinced that she could freeze time like one of the characters. Amused by her enthusiasm, Richard played along. But things took an unexpected turn when Emily, believing she had frozen time with one of her spells, leaned in as if to kiss him. Richard, caught off guard, gently stopped her. "Emily, none of this is real," Richard said with a soft laugh. "It's just a story." Emily blinked, her cheeks flushing as she realized what she had been doing. Then she burst into laughter, shaking her head. "I guess I got a little carried away." Richard smiled, relieved that the awkward moment had passed without any real tension. Later that night, Richard decided to relax by visiting the school's private bathhouse. It was a quiet, peaceful place where he could unwind after the excitement of the dance. He assumed he would be alone, so he didn't expect to run into anyone, especially not Amara. As he walked into the bathhouse, Richard was startled to see Amara there, clearly not expecting anyone either. Both of them were undressed, and the surprise of the encounter left them both blushing furiously. Richard?" Amara stammered, quickly grabbing a towel to cover herself. Richard, equally embarrassed, turned away immediately. "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was here." Amara's face was bright red as she struggled to regain her composure. "It's fine. Just go." Richard didn't need to be told twice. He quickly left the bathhouse, his heart pounding from the embarrassment. The whole situation had been awkward, but it was clear that something had shifted between him and Amara. The way she had looked at him, there was a new tension in the air, something more than just casual friendship. In the days that followed, Richard noticed that Amara was acting differently around him. She wasn't avoiding him, but there was a softness in her voice and a shyness in her smile that hadn't been there before. She even made little jokes about the future, hinting at things like weddings and engagements in a playful but slightly serious way. At the same time, Emily seemed to be showing more interest in Richard as well, frequently seeking him out and asking for his attention. It was becoming clear that the girls around him were starting to see him in a new light, and whether Richard liked it or not, his time at Ivory Heights was becoming a lot more complicated. Richard had spent the last few days feeling increasingly uneasy. The growing romantic tension between him, Amara, and Emily was becoming hard to ignore. What had once been simple curiosity about him had turned into something more complicated, and it made his time at Ivory Heights Academy feel awkward and uncomfortable. He didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but he also didn't want things to spiral out of control. It was clear that Amara and Emily were both starting to see him in a more personal way, and the other girls were watching closely, as if waiting to see how things would unfold. That's when Richard had an idea, something that might help ease the awkwardness and return things to a more comfortable place. He decided to introduce the concept of a commoners club, a group where the girls could learn about life outside their wealthy, privileged backgrounds. He hoped that by focusing on something educational and meaningful, they would stop seeing him as some sort of romantic interest and start understanding him as a regular person. One afternoon, after classes, Richard gathered a small group of girls in one of the classrooms, including Amara and Emily. The girls were curious, not sure what this commoners club was all about, but they were eager to hear what Richard had to say. Standing in front of them, Richard cleared his throat and tried to ignore the nervous flutter in his chest. "I wanted to start this club because I've noticed something," Richard began. "A lot of you seem really interested in me, maybe more interested than I expected, and I think part of that is because, well, I'm different from what you're used to." Amara and Emily exchanged glances while the other girls nodded slightly, clearly intrigued. "You've all grown up in a world that's very different from mine," Richard continued, choosing his words carefully. "You've had lives of privilege, And I don't think you've spent much time around people who don't come from the same background as you. I think what you're feeling, this excitement about having someone new and different in your midst, might not be real feelings. It's just, you're not used to being around someone like me. The girls listened quietly, taking in his words. Richard could tell that some of them were starting to understand what he was getting at. I'm just a regular person, Richard said with a small smile. I come from a simple home, and I've grown up in a very different world from yours. This club is a chance for me to show you what life is like outside of this bubble, to teach you about the things that are normal for people like me, and maybe through that, we can all get a better understanding of each other. There was a brief silence as the girls absorbed what he had said. Then, to Richard's relief, Amara spoke up, her tone thoughtful. You're right, Richard, she said slowly. We've all been a bit caught up in having someone new around. I think we've been so focused on how different you are that we forgot to see you as just a person. Emily nodded in agreement. Yeah, it's like we've been treating you like some kind of celebrity, but you're just Richard, and we shouldn't be making things weird. Richard smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. Exactly. I just want to be treated like everyone else here, so let's focus on learning from each other. With that, the Commoners Club was officially born. The girls, especially Amara and Emily, were eager to learn more about Richard's life outside of their privileged world. The club became a place where they could ask questions and learn about everyday life. Things like how to cook simple meals, take public transport, and understand the value of money. Richard found that teaching them these things helped break down the barriers between them. The girls started to see him as someone they could relate to, not as some mysterious boy who didn't belong in their world. And slowly, the awkwardness that had been growing between him, Amara, and Emily began to fade. During one of the first club meetings, Richard taught the girls how to prepare a simple meal of beans and rice. They had never cooked for themselves before, and it was amusing to watch them struggle with the basics of chopping vegetables and boiling water. Amara laughed as she fumbled with the knife. I never thought I'd be cooking like this, she admitted. We've always had maids and chefs to do this stuff, but it's kind of fun, Emily added, stirring the pot of beans. I feel like I'm actually doing something for myself. Richard smiled, enjoying the fact that they were all getting involved. It's not just about cooking, he said. It's about learning to appreciate the small things in life, things that you might not notice when everything is done for you. The girls nodded, and Richard could see that they were starting to get it. They were beginning to understand that life outside their world of privilege wasn't something to be looked down on. It was just different, and that was okay. As the days went by, the Commoners Club became one of the most popular activities at Ivory Heights Academy. More girls joined, curious to learn from Richard and experience a slice of life that they had never known. They practiced cooking, learned how to shop on a budget, and even took a mock lesson on how to use public transport, which most of them had never done. The best part was that the awkward feelings between Richard, Amara, and Emily had started to disappear. The club gave them something to focus on other than their complicated emotions, and it allowed them to build genuine friendships without the pressure of romantic tension hanging over them. As the Commoners Club continued to grow, Richard found himself becoming an unexpected leader at Ivory Heights Academy. More girls were joining the club, eager to learn about life outside their privileged bubble, and the attention Richard was getting from them only seemed to increase. He was starting to realize just how much influence he had, especially when it came to Emily. Emily, known for being lively and full of energy, had always been a bit distant when it came to certain things. The girls at Ivory Heights often had personal maids or caretakers, and Emily was no different. Her caretaker, Madame Grace, had always found it difficult to get Emily to accept food or care from anyone. Emily preferred doing things her way, often brushing off help and taking her meals alone. One afternoon during a club meeting, Richard noticed that Emily was quieter than usual. While the other girls were excitedly preparing a simple meal of ugali and vegetables, Emily sat to the side, distracted. Concerned, Richard approached her with a plate of food. Here, Emily, you haven't eaten much today, Richard said, holding out the plate to her. To his surprise, Emily smiled and accepted the plate without hesitation. She took a bite, and the others around them noticed the small moment, including Madame Grace, who had been quietly observing from the side of the room. It was rare for Emily to take food from anyone, and the fact that she had accepted it from Richard without complaint surprised even her caretaker. Madam Grace exchanged a look with another staff member, her eyes narrowing as she realized just how much Richard's presence was influencing the girls. His calm, down-to-earth nature was having a bigger impact than anyone had expected. Meanwhile, the dynamics at the academy were shifting in other ways. Zawadi, who had always been aggressive towards Richard, was becoming more unpredictable. Zawadi had made it clear from the start that she didn't approve of Richard being at the academy. She saw him as a disruption, someone who didn't belong, and her anger had only been building over time. One afternoon, during sports practice, Zawadi cornered Richard near the athletic field. Her eyes were fierce, and she was holding a wooden training stick, using it to tap the ground as she approached him. "You think you're so special, don't you?" Zawadi spat, her voice filled with frustration. "You think just because the other girls like you, you can come in here and change everything?" Richard blinked, confused by her sudden aggression. "Zawadi, I don't think I'm special." But Zawadi wasn't listening. Her anger had taken over, and before Richard could react, she swung the training stick at him. Richard dodged, barely managing to step out of the way in time. "Zawadi, stop!" Richard shouted, backing away. But Zawadi didn't stop. She charged at him again, her movements quick and calculated. Richard stumbled as he tried to avoid her, but in the chaos of the moment, Zawadi's foot slipped on the wet grass. She lost her balance and fell hard onto the ground, hitting her head on a nearby bench. For a moment, everything was still. Zawadi lay motionless on the ground, and Richard's heart raced with panic. He knelt down beside her, his hands shaking as he checked to see if she was okay. "Zawadi?" he whispered, fear gripping him. Slowly, Zawadi's eyes fluttered open, and she blinked in confusion, clearly dazed from the fall. Richard helped her sit up, and as the fog in her mind cleared, Zawadi looked at him with a different expression, one he had never seen from her before. You saved me," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "I didn't save you," Richard replied, his heart still pounding. "You slipped, and I just made sure you were okay." Zawadi looked down, as if processing the events. Her usual tough exterior had softened, and for the first time, she seemed vulnerable. "I've been wrong about you," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought you were just here to cause problems. But maybe I've been the one causing the problems." Richard was taken aback by her words. Zawadi had always been the most difficult girl to deal with, but now she seemed to be re-evaluating her entire approach to him. She looked up at him, her eyes serious. "Teach me," she said suddenly. Richard blinked. "Teach you what?" "Teach me what you've been teaching the other girls," Zawadi said, determination creeping into her voice. "How to live without relying on all this privilege. I want to learn. To be better." Richard hesitated, unsure if she was serious, but the look in her eyes told him she was. Zawadi, the girl who had been his biggest critic, was now asking to be his student. It was an unexpected turn of events, but Richard could see that her respect for him had grown. "Okay," Richard said finally, offering her a hand to help her up. "But it's not going to be easy." Zawadi took his hand and stood up, brushing off the dirt. "I don't expect it to be." As the Commoners Club continued to expand, more and more girls wanted to join. What had started as a small group of curious students had now grown into a full-fledged movement within Ivory Heights. The girls were eager to learn about the world outside their privileged lives, and Richard was becoming the key to unlocking that understanding for them. However, with the growing popularity of the club came new tensions. The girls were starting to compete for Richard's attention in ways that made things uncomfortable. Small rivalries began to form, especially between Amara and Emily, who were both vying for Richard's time and approval. One afternoon, during a club meeting, Amara and Emily got into a heated argument over something trivial. Amara had suggested they try a new activity, but Emily shot down the idea, claiming that it wasn't practical. The argument quickly escalated, with both girls raising their voices, and Richard found himself caught in the middle. "Why do you always have to disagree with me, Emily?" Amara snapped, crossing her arms. "Because your ideas are ridiculous," Emily retorted. "Not everything has to be about impressing Richard." The tension in the room was now very obvious, and the other girls exchanged uneasy glances. Richard could see that things were getting out of hand, and he quickly stepped in to calm them down. "Hey, both of you, stop," Richard said firmly, raising his hands. "This isn't about me. We're here to learn, not to compete with each other." The girls fell silent, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Richard's words seemed to have struck a chord with them, and they slowly backed down. Despite the occasional conflicts, the girls eventually started to bond over their shared experiences in the Commoners Club. As they learned more about each other's lives and backgrounds, they began to understand that they weren't so different after all. The club became a place where they could drop their pretenses and be themselves, free from the pressures of their wealthy upbringings. And through it all, Richard's influence continued to grow. He had come to Ivory Heights as an outsider, but now he was at the center of a new movement, one that was changing the lives of the girls around him, one step at a time. As time passed at Ivory Heights Academy, the girls began to realize that their feelings for Richard weren't rooted in romance, but in something deeper. At first, they had been swept up in the excitement of having someone so different in their midst, a boy from a humble background, so unlike the world they had always known. But as they spent more time with him, they began to see him in a new light. Their initial attraction had been more about curiosity and the novelty of having someone who wasn't part of their usual world. But gradually, the girls started to understand that Richard represented something far more important. He was their connection to the outside world, a world they had been sheltered from for most of their lives. Even Zawadi, who had been the most resistant to Richard's presence, started to appreciate the lessons from the Commoners Club. She admired how he had handled himself with grace and dignity, even when faced with her aggression and hostility. Zawadi, who had once challenged everything Richard stood for, now found herself respecting him and his teachings. The Commoners Club continued to grow, and with it so did the girls' understanding of themselves and the world beyond the walls of Ivory Heights. They learned to value the things they had taken for granted, and more importantly, they learned how to interact with people from different backgrounds. Richard too had grown. He had learned to navigate the complex social world of the academy, something he never thought he would be able to do. Over time, he gained the respect and admiration of the girls, not because he was different, but because he treated them as equals, without judgment. More importantly, he had shown them that life outside their privileged bubble wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. The friendships he had formed with the girls became genuine, built on trust and mutual respect rather than the initial excitement of his arrival. For the first time, the girls were learning to see people for who they were, beyond their social status, wealth, or background. Richard had helped them break down those barriers, and in doing so, he had changed their lives. By the end of the school year, Richard had become an important part of Ivory Heights Academy. He wasn't just the only boy in an all-girls school anymore. He was someone the girls looked up to, someone they could count on. His time at the academy had been filled with challenges, but it had also opened doors for him that he never thought possible. Madame Wikali, true to her word, offered to help pay for his university education. But she didn't stop there. She saw the impact Richard had made on the school, and she asked him to return during the holidays to continue mentoring the girls. She believed that the Commoners Club had become an essential part of the school, something that would benefit future generations of students. The Commoners Club became a permanent fixture at Ivory Heights. More girls joined each year, eager to learn from Richard's lessons and understand life outside their sheltered world. The club continued to grow, and it became a symbol of the change Richard had sparked within the academy. As the school year came to an end, Richard stood at the gates of Ivory Heights, preparing to leave. He looked back at the grand buildings and well-maintained gardens with a smile. He had arrived as the son of a maid, unsure of his place in such a world. But he was leaving as someone who had made a real difference, not just in the lives of the girls, but in his own life as well. His journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The future was filled with possibilities, and thanks to the opportunities Madame Wikali had given him, he knew he could face whatever came next. As he stepped outside the gates, he saw his mother, Mama Nandi, waiting for him. She stood there with her arms open, a proud smile on her face. Richard walked towards her, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment wash over him. Together they hugged tightly, the bond between them stronger than ever. Mama Nandi had always believed in him, and now Richard could see that her faith had been well placed. He had grown beyond the boy, who once doubted his place in the world. And as they walked away from the academy side by side, Richard knew that no matter where life took him next, he would always carry the lessons of Ivory Heights with him. The future was bright, and as for what it held, only time will tell.